Single dad janitor pulls a terrified woman from a crashed car in the rain, never imagining she's Judge Helena Rowe, the same judge who destroyed his life 3 years ago by taking away his daughter. Now she sits on the bench at his final custody hearing, trembling behind her gavel, knowing the man she condemned is the man who saved her. Can the person who destroyed your world become your redemption, or will justice finally demand its price? Hello, my family. If you're listening to this story now, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell right now so you never miss what happens next. And drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because this story is about to take you somewhere you won't forget. Now, let's dive into the story and make sure to watch till the end. The clock on the wall read 11:47 p.m. When he finally locked up, the rain already hammering the pavement like fists on a courtroom bench. And he pulled his jacket tighter as he walked to his beaten Honda in the staff parking lot. The car that had seen better decades, but still started every time because he couldn't afford for it not to. Sophie would be asleep by now at Mrs. Chen's apartment, curled up under the blanket he'd sewn patches onto last winter. And the thought of her small breathing body was the only thing keeping him upright as exhaustion tried to drag him under. He started the engine, windshield wipers fighting against the downpour, headlights cutting through sheets of rain that made the world look like it was drowning. The route home was simple, 15 minutes through side streets he'd memorized in his bones. But tonight the storm had other plans, and as he turned onto Riverside Drive, the red taillights ahead of him swerved violently, skidding across wet asphalt in a spray of water and screeching rubber before slamming into the guardrail with a crunch that made his stomach drop. Elias hit his brakes, heart hammering, and for 1 second he thought about driving past, because getting involved in other people's emergencies was how you ended up late, ended up questioned, ended up losing what little control you had left over your own life. But then he saw the car tilt forward, nose dipping toward the edge where the road dropped 15 feet into the churning river below. And his hands were already yanking the wheel toward the shoulder before his brain caught up. He threw his door open and rain slapped his face like a warning, cold and brutal. But he was already running toward the luxury sedan that cost more than 5 years of his salary, its hazard lights flashing weak and desperate in the storm. Through the cracked windshield he could see her, a woman in the driver's seat with blood trickling down her temple, hands gripping the wheel like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. And her eyes found his through the rain and the glass and the darkness with a terror so pure it punched the air from his lungs. "Can you hear me?" he shouted, yanking on the driver's door, but it was jammed, bent from impact, and the car groaned as it shifted another inch toward the edge. I can't move." Her voice cracked, muffled but clear enough. And there was something about the way she said it that made him think she wasn't just talking about her seatbelt. He didn't have time for fear, so he shoved it down deep where he kept everything else that tried to stop him. And he braced his feet against the mud and pulled with everything he had, muscles screaming, rain making his grip slip once, twice. And then the door shrieked open and she gasped like she'd been holding her breath underwater. Her seatbelt was locked, jammed from the impact, and he pulled the pocket knife from his belt, the same one he used to open boxes at work, and sawed through the strap with hands that refused to shake, even though his whole body wanted to. "I've got you," he said. And he didn't know why he said it, because he barely had himself most days. But the words came out anyway, like a promise he had no business making. She fell forward into his arms when the belt snapped free. Dead weight and warm skin and the smell of expensive perfume mixed with blood and fear. And he half carried, half dragged her away from the car, just as it lurched forward with a metallic groan and tipped over the edge, disappearing into the black water below with a splash that sounded like the end of something. They collapsed onto the muddy shoulder together, both of them gasping, rain washing the blood from her face in pink rivulets. And for a moment, neither of them could speak because survival doesn't leave room for words. Her chest heaved against his arm where he'd caught her, and she turned her head slowly, eyes focusing on his face like she was trying to memorize it, or maybe trying to figure out if he was real. "Thank you," she whispered, voice hoarse and broken and sincere in a way that made something in his chest twist. "I owe you my life." Elias looked down at her, this woman in a designer coat that was now ruined, diamonds still glinting at her ears despite the mud and chaos. And he felt nothing but the same tired kindness that made him fix torn shoelaces for students who barely saw him. He didn't know her name, and he didn't need to, because at that moment, she was just another person who needed help, and he was just a man who still believed that mattered. "Just doing what anyone would," he said quietly. And he meant it, even though they both knew it wasn't true, because most people had already driven past. She opened her mouth to say something else, but the sound of sirens cut through the rain, distant but growing closer, and he helped her sit up against the guardrail before standing and waving his arms at the approaching lights. The paramedics would take it from here, and he'd fade back into the background where he belonged. Another invisible man in a city full of them. And by tomorrow, she'd probably forget his face entirely. But as he climbed back into his Honda and pulled away, leaving her in the capable hands of EMTs who wrapped her in silver blankets, he didn't see the way her eyes followed his taillights until they disappeared, or the way her hand clutched the mud-stained business card she'd tried to give him that he'd politely refused. What he also didn't know, what neither of them knew at that moment, was that 3 years ago, Judge Helena Rowe had signed the court order that took his daughter away, and the universe had just thrown them back together in the cruelest, most ironic twist of fate either of them would ever experience. Helena Rowe couldn't sleep, and that terrified her more than the accident itself, because judges didn't lose sleep over strangers. Judges didn't lie awake at 3 in the morning replaying the face of a man who'd pulled them from certain death. But his eyes wouldn't leave her alone. She sat in her home study surrounded by mahogany and leather-bound law books that suddenly felt like props in someone else's life, pressing an ice pack against the stitches on her temple, while her mind circled back to those moments in the rain, when a man in a janitor's uniform had risked everything for someone he didn't know. His voice kept echoing, Elias, Elias Ward, and something about the way he'd said it, quiet and almost apologetic, like his own name was a burden he carried, made her chest tighten with a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. "Elias Ward," she whispered to the empty room, and the name tasted like something she should remember. Something important scratching at the back of her mind, like a prisoner trying to escape. She shouldn't do this. She knew she shouldn't. But her fingers were already opening her laptop, already typing his name into the court database that she had access to even at this ungodly hour. Because justice apparently never slept, even when judges desperately needed to. The search results loaded slowly, each second stretching like taffy. And when his file appeared on screen, her breath caught in her throat hard enough to hurt. Ward v. Child Protective Services, custody appeal denied. Presiding Judge, Helena Rowe. Date, November 8th, 2022. No. Her hand flew to her mouth as the case details flooded back with brutal clarity, 3 years collapsing into this single moment like a building imploding inward. She remembered this case. Of course, she remembered the janitor who'd tried to regain custody of his daughter after his ex-wife had abandoned them both. The man who'd stood in her courtroom wearing a borrowed suit that didn't fit right, speaking in broken sentences about how much he loved his child, while the social worker testified about his 3 jobs and unstable housing and the fact that he couldn't even afford proper childcare. She'd ruled him unfit. She'd called his lifestyle insufficient for a child's developmental needs. She'd signed the order placing his daughter in foster care while he worked out his financial instability. And last night, that same man had saved her life without hesitation, without knowing who she was, without asking for anything in return except the chance to disappear back into the invisibility she'd condemned him to. What have I done? The words came out strangled, barely human, and Helena's hands were shaking so badly she had to set down her coffee mug before she dropped it. She scrolled through the case file with mounting horror, reading her own words from 3 years ago. The petitioner lacks the economic stability and emotional resources necessary to provide adequate care. And each sentence felt like a knife twisting deeper into her conscience because she'd been so certain, so absolutely convinced she was protecting a child, when all she'd really been protecting was her own narrow definition of what a parent should look like. The report had mentioned his 3 jobs: elementary school janitor, weekend grocery store stocker, and occasional handyman work. But she'd seen chaos where there was actually sacrifice. She'd seen instability where there was actually devotion, so fierce it made grown men work 70-hour weeks just to afford birthday presents for children they weren't allowed to see. Do you think she made the right call 3 years ago? Or does poverty erase a parent's love? Comment below because this question matters more than you know. Helena pulled up the custody evaluation report, and there it was, in black and white. Mr. Ward demonstrates strong emotional attachment to the minor child. However, his current living situation in a 1-bedroom apartment and a regular work schedule presents significant concerns. And she wanted to scream, because since when did loving your child with every cell in your body count for nothing if you couldn't afford a 2-bedroom apartment in a city where rent consumed souls faster than drugs ever could? Her desk phone rang, shattering the 3 a.m. silence like a gunshot, and she nearly jumped out of her skin before grabbing it with trembling fingers. "Judge Rowe," she answered, voice hoarse. "Helena, it's Marcus." Her senior clerk calling at this hour, which meant something significant had happened. "I know you're recovering, but I thought you should hear this immediately. The mayor's office just filed a motion to reopen the Ward custody case." The room tilted. "What?" she breathed. Apparently there's been media pressure about wrongful removals in the foster system, and someone flagged the Ward case as a potential example of— Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully— economic discrimination masquerading as child welfare. Helena closed her eyes and saw Elias Ward's face in the rain, saw the way he'd sawed through her seatbelt, with hands that probably hadn't stopped shaking until hours later, saw the way he'd asked for nothing and expected even less because people like him had learned that the system wasn't built to see them as fully human. "When's the hearing?" she asked quietly. 2 weeks. Friday the 24th. And Helena. Marcus hesitated. "The assignment just came through. You're the presiding judge." The phone slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the desk, and for several seconds she couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process the cosmic cruelty of a universe that would force her to sit in judgment over the man who'd saved her life. The man whose life she'd already destroyed once, with the casual stroke of a pen. She had 2 choices, and both of them were impossible. She could recuse herself from the case and never tell anyone why. Let another judge decide Elias Ward's fate without knowing what kind of man he truly was. Or she could stay on the case and risk everything— her career, her reputation, her carefully constructed walls of professional distance, all for the chance to possibly make things right. But how do you make right something you broke so thoroughly that the pieces don't even fit together anymore? Helena stood up and walked to her window, staring out at the city lights that looked like fallen stars scattered across the darkness. And somewhere out there, Elias Ward was probably sleeping in that 1-bedroom apartment she'd judged so harshly. probably dreaming of a daughter he was allowed to see for exactly 4 supervised hours per month. Probably waking up in a few hours to mop more floors so he could afford the lawyer fees for an appeal he didn't even know was coming. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and made a decision that would either redeem her soul or destroy her completely. She would stay on the case. She would sit in that courtroom and face the man whose eyes had looked at her with such unguarded kindness in the rain. And she would find a way to give him back what she'd stolen, even if it meant admitting she'd been catastrophically wrong. Because judges were supposed to be infallible. But she was learning that some mistakes don't get to hide behind a robe and a gavel. Some mistakes come back in the form of a janitor who saves your life and doesn't even know he owes an apology bigger than the Grand Canyon. Her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant judge, confirmed. Ward Custody Review, November 24th, 10 a.m., Courtroom 6. You're presiding. Let me know if you need anything. Helena typed back with shaking fingers. I need to know if redemption is possible when the person you wronged doesn't even know they should hate you. But she deleted it before sending and wrote instead, confirmed. Pull all original case files and testimony transcripts. I want everything. Because if she was going to face Elias Ward across a courtroom, if she was going to look into those eyes that had saved her without judgment, she needed to understand exactly how badly she'd failed him the first time, so she could make absolutely certain she didn't fail him again. The universe had given her a second chance, wrapped in rain and twisted metal, and the kind of irony that would be funny if it wasn't so devastating. She just prayed she was strong enough to take it. Elias Ward's alarm clock screamed at 4:30 a.m. like it was angry at the world. And honestly, he couldn't blame it, because he was pretty angry too. Angry at the exhaustion that had become his permanent state of being. Angry at the 3 jobs that barely kept the lights on. Angry at a system that measured a father's love in square footage and bank statements, instead of the way his heart stopped every time he thought about his daughter's laugh. He slapped the alarm silent and dragged himself out of bed, bones creaking like he was 60 instead of 34. And stumbled to the bathroom of his 1-bedroom apartment that the judge 3 years ago had deemed inadequate for child rearing, even though it was clean and safe and filled with more love than most mansions ever saw. The mirror showed him a stranger, dark circles carved so deep under his eyes they looked like bruises, stubble he didn't have time to shave, shoulders that carried weight invisible to everyone except him. But he splashed cold water on his face and told that stranger the same thing he said every morning. Sophie needs you, so move. By 5 a.m., he was out the door for his first shift at Lincoln Elementary, mopping hallways before the children arrived, scrubbing toilets that somehow always needed scrubbing, wiping down desks while teachers who made 4 times his salary walked past without seeing him because janitors were like ghosts, necessary but unnoticed. His knees ached by 7 a.m. and his back screamed by 9 a.m. But he kept moving because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering that today was Wednesday, which meant tomorrow was Thursday, which meant the day after that was Friday. And Friday meant he got exactly 4 supervised hours with Sophie at the community center where a social worker named Patricia watched them like they were criminals planning an escape. Morning, Elias, called Mrs. Rodriguez, the 3rd-grade teacher who actually knew his name, was one of maybe 5 staff members in the entire school who treated him like a human being instead of furniture. Morning, Mrs. R., he replied, wringing out his mop in the big yellow bucket that had become an extension of his body. You look tired. Are you taking care of yourself? He smiled because lying was easier than explaining that taking care of himself was a luxury reserved for people who didn't have to work 70 hours a week just to afford the lawyer retainer for an appeal that probably wouldn't change anything. Always do. She didn't believe him. He could see it in her eyes, but she smiled back anyway and headed to her classroom. And Elias returned to his mop and his thoughts that never stopped circling back to Sophie's face the last time he'd seen her. The way she'd cried when their 4 hours were up, and Patricia had gently pulled her away, while Sophie screamed, "Daddy, don't leave me. Daddy, please." And he'd had to walk out of that building with his heart in pieces because staying would have violated the court order, and violating court orders was how you lost your daughter permanently. The morning shift ended at noon, and he had exactly 45 minutes to get to his second job at Patterson's Grocery on 5th Street, where he stocked shelves and unloaded delivery trucks and smiled at customers who looked through him like he was made of glass. His supervisor, Kenny, was a decent guy who let him take bathroom breaks without docking his pay, which was more kindness than most employers offered. And Elias was grateful, even though gratitude felt like a knife sometimes. Because why should basic human decency feel like a gift? "Ward, we got 3 pallets in the back need breaking down," Kenny called out at 2 p.m., and Elias nodded and headed to the storage area where boxes stacked to the ceiling waited to be unpacked, sorted, and shelved with the kind of mind-numbing repetition that either broke you or made you zen. And Elias had decided a long time ago that zen was just another word for surviving. His phone buzzed at 3:17 p.m., and his heart seized because midday texts were either emergencies or bad news. And in his experience, those two things were usually the same. He pulled it out with shaking hands and saw the message from his lawyer, Bennett, who charged him $200 an hour that Elias paid in installments that would probably outlive him. "Need to talk. Call me when you can." Could you keep working after a text like that, or would fear paralyze you? Drop a comment and tell us what you do, because what comes next changes everything. Elias waited until his break at 4 p.m. and then called Bennett from the alley behind the store where the dumpsters smelled like rotting produce and broken dreams. "Bennett, it's Elias. Got your message." "Elias, hey." Bennett's voice had that careful lawyer tone that meant he was choosing his words like a bomb technician choosing wires. "So listen, something unexpected happened. The mayor's office filed a motion to reopen your custody case." The world stopped. "What?" Elias breathed, and the word came out strangled, barely human. "There's been media pressure about the foster system, and they flagged your case as potentially looked. I don't want to get your hopes up, but there's going to be a new hearing. 2 weeks from Friday, we get another shot." Elias's legs went weak, and he leaned against the brick wall because standing suddenly required more strength than he possessed. Another hearing. Another chance to... Yes. To present evidence, to show how you've maintained stability, to demonstrate that you're fit. But Elias... Bennett paused, and the pause felt like falling. The presiding judge is the same one from before. Judge Helena Rowe. The name hit him like a fist to the sternum, and suddenly he was back in that courtroom 3 years ago, standing in a borrowed suit while a woman in black robes looked at him like he was a problem to be solved rather than a father begging for his child. Listening to her explain in clinical legal language why his love wasn't enough. Why his 3 jobs proved instability instead of dedication. Why Sophie would be better served in foster care while he addressed his economic situation, which was just a polite way of saying, poor people don't deserve their children. "The same judge," he repeated flatly. "I know it's not ideal, but she already decided I'm not good enough, Bennett. What makes you think she'll change her mind now?" Because people can change. Because circumstances can change. Because you've done everything they asked and more. You've maintained steady employment. You've never missed a supervised visit. You've completed the parenting classes they required, even though you're a better father than most of the people who mandated them. We have a real shot here. Elias closed his eyes and saw Sophie's face. Her eyes that looked exactly like his own. Her smile that could light up the darkest room. her small hand in his during those precious 4 hours every week when he got to be her dad, instead of just the man who'd failed to be wealthy enough to keep her. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay. We do it. When do you need me?" "I'll send over the details tonight. And Elias, don't give up. Not now." But giving up was the only thing Elias had never done. Even when giving up would have been easier than this endless war of hope against a system designed to crush people like him. This quiet battle he fought every single day in mop water and grocery store aisles and the empty apartment that should have been filled with his daughter's laughter. He finished his shift in a daze and drove straight to Mrs. Chen's apartment, where Sophie was waiting, where she spent her weekdays after school because the foster family she lived with didn't get out of work until 6, and Mrs. Chen had offered to help because she was 83 years old and had lost her own son 20 years ago. And she saw in Elias the kind of father her son should have had. "Daddy!" Sophie flew into his arms the second he walked through the door. All 7 years and 42 pounds of pure joy. And Elias caught her and held on like she was oxygen itself. "Hey, baby girl," he whispered into her hair that smelled like strawberry shampoo. "I missed you so much. Mrs. Chen let me help make dumplings. I folded 6 all by myself." He looked over Sophie's head as Mrs. Chen stood in her tiny kitchen, smiling with tears in her eyes, because she understood that this shouldn't be a special visit. This should be every day. This should be normal instead of stolen moments between court orders and supervised schedules. "You're a dumpling master now," Elias said, setting Sophie down and kneeling so they were eye to eye. "Pretty soon, you'll be teaching Mrs. Chen." Sophie giggled, and it was the most beautiful sound in the universe. Better than music, better than anything. And Elias memorized it because he had to make these moments last until Friday. Until the next 4 supervised hours. Until maybe, possibly, impossibly, the hearing in 2 weeks that could either give him back his daughter or break him completely. "Daddy, can we have pancakes Saturday? The star-shaped ones you make?" Saturday was their next visit day, and Elias nodded, even though he wasn't allowed to cook for her during supervised visits. Wasn't allowed to do 100 normal parent things, because the court had decided he needed to be monitored like a criminal. "We'll see what we can do, okay?" She hugged him again, and he closed his eyes and prayed to whatever God might be listening, that Judge Helena Rowe would look at him different this time. Would see past the janitor uniform to the father underneath. Would understand that poverty wasn't neglect and sacrifice wasn't instability and love. Real love should count for something in a world that measured everything in dollars and square feet. He didn't know that the judge was already drowning in regret, already planning her redemption, already realizing she'd destroyed the wrong man. He just knew that in 2 weeks, his entire life would be decided again by the same woman who'd already broken it once. And this time he had to find a way to make her see him, really see him, before it was too late. Helena Rowe told herself she was going to Lincoln Elementary for research purposes. Told herself that observing Elias Ward's work environment was simply due diligence for the upcoming hearing. Told herself all the lies that judges tell themselves when they know they're crossing lines that should never be crossed but can't stop their feet from moving forward anyway. She wore civilian clothes, jeans, and a simple jacket because showing up in her judicial robes would have been absurd, and she signed in at the front desk as a prospective parent touring the facility, even though the lie tasted like ash in her mouth, because lying had never been part of her job description until the night a janitor saved her life and shattered every certainty she'd built her career on. The hallways smelled like industrial cleaner and cafeteria pizza, and she walked slowly past classrooms where children laughed and teachers taught, searching for him even though she didn't know what she'd say if their eyes met, didn't know how to explain that she was here because guilt had become a living thing inside her chest that wouldn't let her sleep or breathe or exist without trying to understand who Elias Ward really was beyond the case file that had reduced him to statistics and inadequacies. She found him in the West Corridor, kneeling on the floor in front of a little girl, maybe 6 years old, who was crying with the kind of broken sobs that children make when something matters more than adults realize. And Helena stopped walking, pressed herself against the wall where she could watch without being seen, and felt her heart crack right down the middle at what happened next. "Hey there," Elias said softly, his voice so gentle it made Helena's throat tighten. "What's wrong?" The little girl held up her shoe, and the sole was separating from the upper, flapping like a mouth with every step, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "It's broken, and Mama can't buy new ones until next month, and everyone's gonna laugh at me." Elias didn't hesitate. Didn't tell her it wasn't a big deal, or that she was overreacting the way so many adults would have. Instead, he reached into his maintenance cart and pulled out a small tube of industrial adhesive and said, "I think we can fix this. But I'm gonna need your expert opinion on whether it looks good enough when we're done. Deal?" The girl nodded, sniffling. And Helena watched as this janitor, who supposedly wasn't fit to raise his own daughter, carefully applied glue to the shoe with the precision of a surgeon, holding the sole in place while he counted to 60 out loud, so the girl could count with him, turning a crisis into a game, transforming shame into something that felt almost like magic. "There," he said finally, testing the bond with gentle fingers. "Good as new. Maybe even better, because now it's got a story, right? Battle scars make us stronger." The little girl's face transformed, tears drying like someone had flipped a switch. And she threw her arms around Elias's neck with the unself-conscious affection that children only give to people who truly see them. "Thank you, Mr. Elias. You're the best. You're pretty great yourself, kiddo. Now get back to class before Mrs. Patterson sends a search party." Helena's vision blurred, and she realized with horror that she was crying, standing in a school hallway, crying like she was the child with the broken shoe instead of the judge who'd broken a family. And she understood in that moment exactly how catastrophically wrong she'd been 3 years ago. Because fitness wasn't about bank accounts or apartment sizes. Fitness was about the way a man treated a crying child, who wasn't even his own, the way he carried adhesive in his cart just in case someone needed fixing, the way he turned humiliation into hope, with nothing but patience and presence. If you believe good people can be invisible, that the system fails to see what truly matters, hit that subscribe button right now, because justice is about to get complicated. She turned to leave before he could see her, before she had to explain why a stranger was lurking in school hallways, watching janitors repair shoes. But her foot caught the edge of a cleaning bucket, and it tipped with a clatter that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet corridor. Elias looked up. Their eyes met, and Helena watched recognition dawn slowly across his face. Not recognition of her as the judge. He still didn't know that part. But recognition of her as the woman from the accident, the woman he'd pulled from a drowning car, the woman whose life he'd saved without asking for anything in return. "You," he said quietly, standing up. And there was no accusation in his voice, just surprise mixed with something that looked almost like concern. "Are you okay? Your head—" "I'm fine," she said quickly. Too quickly, and her voice came out strangled. "I just toured the school and I saw—" She couldn't finish because what could she possibly say that wouldn't sound insane? And Elias took a step toward her with that same gentle wariness he'd used with the crying child, like he thought Helena might bolt if he moved too fast. "Do I know you from somewhere else?" he asked. And the question hung in the air between them like a blade. "Besides the accident, I mean." You look familiar. Helena's mouth went dry, because this was it. This was the moment she could tell him the truth, could say, yes, you know me. I'm the judge who took your daughter. I'm the one who called you unfit. I'm the reason you work 3 jobs and cry yourself to sleep and live in an apartment you're ashamed of, even though you shouldn't be. But instead, she shook her head and whispered, No, no, I don't think so. The lie felt like swallowing poison. But she couldn't do this here. Couldn't unravel his world in a school hallway where children might hear. Couldn't watch his face change from kindness to hatred in the space between heartbeats. I should go, she said, backing toward the exit. I'm sorry for disturbing you. Wait, Elias called after her. But Helena was already walking fast, nearly running, fleeing from the man whose life she'd destroyed and who still looked at her like she deserved to be saved. And by the time she reached her car in the parking lot, she was shaking so hard she could barely get the key in the ignition. She sat there for 10 minutes, watching Lincoln Elementary through her windshield, watching the building that housed a janitor who fixed children's shoes with the same care he'd used to cut her free from a seatbelt. And she made a decision that would either redeem her completely or condemn her forever. She would stay on his case. She would sit in that courtroom in 10 days, and she would find a way to give Elias Ward back his daughter, even if it meant destroying her own career in the process. Because some debts couldn't be paid with apologies. Some debts required sacrifice. The article dropped on a Tuesday morning like a bomb disguised as journalism, and by noon, Elias Ward's name was trending on local social media for all the wrong reasons, because some rival judge with a political axe to grind had leaked Helena's 3-year-old ruling to a reporter who specialized in turning human suffering into clickbait gold. The headline screamed across every phone screen in the city, "Unfit father appeals again. Judge questions if janitor can ever provide adequate home." And beneath it was Elias's intake photo from the original custody hearing. The one where he looked exhausted and desperate and exactly like the kind of man people loved to judge from the safety of their comfortable lives. Elias saw it on his phone during his grocery store shift, standing in the cereal aisle with a box of Cheerios in one hand and his entire world collapsing in the other. And the worst part wasn't the article itself, but the comments section that had exploded into 500 opinions from strangers who'd never mopped a floor or worked 3 jobs or loved a child so much it physically hurt to breathe. If he can't afford a decent place, maybe he shouldn't have kids. Someone named Boston Mom 2024 wrote, and 43 people had liked it. Janitors don't make enough to raise children properly. This is just facts, added another user. And Elias felt something inside him start to crack because he had spent 3 years trying to prove he was more than his job title, more than his bank account, more than the apartment size that judges use to measure a father's worth. He called Bennett immediately, voice shaking. Did you see it? I'm looking at it now, his lawyer said. And the fury in Bennett's voice was the only thing keeping Elias from completely falling apart. This is a violation of judicial confidentiality. Someone leaked sealed documents to sabotage your hearing. Does it matter? Elias asked. And he hated how defeated he sounded, hated that he was standing in a grocery store fighting back tears while customers pushed carts past him like he was just another obstacle in their way. Everyone thinks I'm a deadbeat now. Everyone thinks I don't deserve her. Everyone's wrong, Bennett said firmly, and we're going to prove it in 9 days. But 9 days felt like 9 years when Sophie called him that afternoon crying so hard she could barely speak. And Elias had to pull over on his way to his evening handyman job because driving while your heart was being ripped out seemed dangerous. Daddy, the kids at school, she sobbed, and each word was a knife. They said you're a bad person. They said their mom saw the article. They called me the janitor's kid like it's something bad. Baby, listen to me, Elias said. gripping his steering wheel so hard his knuckles went white. There is nothing wrong with being a janitor. There is nothing wrong with working hard to take care of the people you love. Those kids don't know what they're talking about. But why did the newspapers say mean things about you? Why did they show your picture like you did something wrong? How do you explain systemic injustice to a 7-year-old? How do you tell your daughter that the world measures people by dollars instead of devotion? Comment below if you've ever felt invisible because of what you do for a living. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, Elias said carefully, because he couldn't bring himself to destroy her faith in the system that was supposed to protect her. Sometimes they don't understand the whole story. But I promise you, Sophie, I promise on everything I am that I'm fighting for you, okay? I'm always fighting for you. She sniffled and whispered, I know, Daddy. I love you. I love you more than the whole sky, baby girl. What Elias didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that Helena Rowe was sitting in her chambers at that exact moment, reading the same article with mounting horror, watching her own words from 3 years ago being weaponized against a man who'd saved her life. And something inside her finally snapped because she'd spent her entire career believing the law was objective, when really it was just a mirror reflecting the biases of whoever held the gavel. She called her assistant Marcus within seconds. I need you to set up an anonymous donation to Lincoln Elementary. $50,000 earmarked specifically for facility improvements and staff appreciation. Judge, that's highly unusual. I don't care. Make it happen, today. And make absolutely certain my name doesn't appear anywhere. She couldn't undo the article. Couldn't erase the public humiliation Elias was enduring because of her original ruling. But she could do this one small thing. Could funnel money into the school where he worked and hope that somehow, in some small way, it would make his life slightly less impossible, even if he never knew where it came from. The donation processed by 5 p.m., and by Wednesday morning, Lincoln Elementary's principal was standing in the staff lounge announcing that an anonymous benefactor had provided funding for a complete renovation of the staff facilities, new equipment, and a salary bonus for all support staff, including custodial workers. And Elias stood there with his mop, listening to cheers erupt around him, while Kenny, the grocery supervisor, texted him that the store had received a similar anonymous grant, specifically designated for employee assistance programs. Can you believe it? Mrs. Rodriguez said to Elias, eyes shining. It's like someone sent angels. Yeah, Elias replied quietly, staring at his phone where Sophie's tear-stained voice still echoed in his memory. Angels. He didn't know the angel was the judge who'd condemned him. Didn't know that Helena Rowe was bleeding herself financially trying to patch wounds she'd inflicted with legal documents. Didn't know that guilt had driven her to empty half her savings into anonymous acts of restitution that could never actually balance the scales of what she'd taken from him. That evening, a news reporter ambushed him outside Lincoln Elementary as he was leaving his shift, shoving a microphone in his face while a camera rolled. Mr. Ward, is it true you're fighting a losing battle again? Do you really think Judge Rowe will change her mind after calling you unfit 3 years ago? Elias looked directly into the camera, and for once he didn't hide, didn't shrink, didn't apologize for being poor or tired or human. I think everyone deserves a second chance to be seen for who they really are instead of what they lack. I think my daughter deserves a father who loves her more than anything in this world. And I think if the system can't see that love matters more than money, then the system needs to change. Not me. The clip went viral by midnight, shared 50,000 times by people who'd never met him, but recognized the exhaustion in his voice, the dignity in his refusal to be ashamed. And somewhere in her study, Helena watched it on repeat with tears streaming down her face. Because he was right. He was absolutely right. And she'd been so catastrophically wrong that it felt like standing on the edge of an abyss. 8 days until the hearing. 8 days to figure out how to give him back his daughter without revealing she was the woman whose life he'd saved. 8 days to decide if redemption was even possible when the debt was this enormous. Bennett called Elias at 11 p.m. on Thursday night, which was never good because lawyers who charged $200 an hour didn't make social calls after business hours unless the world was ending or about to. And Elias answered on the second ring with his heart already climbing into his throat because bad news always came when you were too exhausted to fight it. Elias, I need to tell you something and you're not going to like it, Bennett said without preamble, his voice carrying the weight of someone about to detonate a bomb in a crowded room. Just say it, Elias replied, sitting down on his couch that sagged in the middle because he'd bought it 6 years ago and couldn't afford to replace it. Judge Helena Rowe, the woman presiding over your hearing tomorrow. She's the same person you pulled from that car accident 2 weeks ago. The words hit Elias like a physical blow, and for several seconds he couldn't process them, couldn't make them fit into any reality that made sense because the universe couldn't possibly be that cruel, that perfectly, cosmically sadistic. What? I just found out from a court clerk who saw the accident report. The woman you saved, the one you risked your life for, that was Judge Rowe, the same judge who took Sophie away 3 years ago. Elias's phone slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the floor, and he sat there staring at nothing, while his brain tried to reconcile two impossible truths. The terrified woman gasping for air in the rain was the same woman who'd signed the document calling him unfit. The same woman who'd looked at him across a courtroom and decided his love wasn't enough. The same woman whose life he'd saved without hesitation, because that's what decent humans did, even when the world had stopped being decent to them. Elias, are you still there? He picked up the phone with shaking hands. She knew. When I saw her at the school, she knew who I was, and she didn't say anything. Maybe she didn't recognize you. She recognized me, Elias said flatly, remembering the way Helena's face had gone pale when their eyes met. The way she'd fled like she was escaping a crime scene, the way she'd lied and said they didn't know each other when her eyes had screamed the opposite. She knew exactly who I was, and she ran. Bennett was quiet for a moment, and then said carefully, "This could actually work in our favor. She owes you her life. That's leverage." "I don't want leverage," Elias snapped, and the fury rising in his chest felt like it might consume him completely. "I want my daughter back because I'm a good father, not because some judge feels guilty that I saved her ungrateful life." Elias. But he'd already hung up because he couldn't breathe in his apartment anymore, couldn't sit still with this knowledge burning through his veins like acid. And before he knew what he was doing, he was in his Honda driving through the dark city toward Riverside Drive, where the accident had happened, where he'd pulled a stranger from certain death, where he'd been kind because kindness was supposed to matter, even when nothing else did. He parked on the shoulder where her car had skidded and walked to the spot where the guardrail was still bent from impact. And the rain started falling again, like the universe had a sick sense of narrative symmetry. And Elias stood there, getting soaked, while his mind replayed that night in excruciating detail, her terrified eyes through the windshield, her voice breaking as she thanked him, the way she'd whispered, "I owe you my life," like it was a sacred vow, when really it had been just another lie from someone who'd already destroyed him once. If you were in his position, could you forgive the person who took everything from you just because you saved their life? Hit subscribe if you believe in second chances. Comment below if you think some betrayals are unforgivable. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said to the empty air, to the rain, to the ghost of that night. "Why did you let me stand there at that school looking like an idiot when you knew what you'd done to me?" His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out to see a text from an unknown number. "Mr. Ward, this is Judge Rowe's clerk. Your hearing has been moved up to 10 a.m. tomorrow instead of 2 p.m. Judge Rowe herself requested the change. Please confirm receipt." Elias stared at the message, and something cold settled in his stomach, because this wasn't a scheduling adjustment. This was Helena Rowe trying to control the narrative, trying to get ahead of something. Trying to what? Absolve herself? Rule in his favor out of guilt instead of justice? Use her power to rewrite the story so she could sleep at night? He texted back, "Received. I'll be there." But what he wanted to text was, "You don't get to save me just because I saved you. You don't get to fix this with a gavel when you broke it with one 3 years ago. You don't get redemption by returning what you never should have stolen in the first place." He drove home in silence, windshield wipers beating against the rain that wouldn't stop falling. And when he walked into his apartment, he went straight to the small box he kept on the top shelf of his closet. The one that held every document from the original custody case. The social worker reports, the financial statements, the character references, and the final ruling signed in Helena Rowe's precise handwriting, declaring him insufficient in every way that courts measured sufficiency. He read her words again under the dim light of his bedroom lamp. While the petitioner demonstrates affection for the minor child, his current economic instability and inadequate housing situation present significant concerns for the child's welfare and development. Custody is hereby denied pending substantial improvement in living conditions and financial security. Affection. She'd called his love affection, like he was a friendly dog instead of a father who would have walked through fire for his daughter. Made so, like the way his heart beat. Sophie's name with every pulse was just a pleasant emotion instead of the fundamental architecture of his entire existence. "Tomorrow," he whispered to the empty room, to the court documents, to the universe that kept testing him. "Tomorrow, I look her in the eyes, and I make her see what she did. I make her understand that saving my life doesn't erase destroying it first." He set his alarm for 6 a.m. because the hearing was at 10 and he needed time to prepare. Needed time to put on the same borrowed suit he'd worn 3 years ago. Needed time to practice keeping his voice steady when every cell in his body would be screaming at the woman on the bench who'd saved herself by letting him drown. But sleep wouldn't come because his mind kept circling back to that moment in the rain when he'd cut through her seatbelt and caught her falling body. And he wondered what he would have done if he'd known who she was. If he would have still saved her, or if he would have hesitated just long enough for gravity to win. And the fact that he didn't know the answer to that question terrified him more than the hearing itself, because he'd always believed he was a good man. But apparently everyone had limits to their goodness, and Judge Helena Rowe had found his 3 years ago, when she'd signed her name to his heartbreak. 6 hours until the hearing. 6 hours until he faced the woman who held his fate in her hands for the second time. 6 hours until he discovered if redemption was possible, or if some debts were too enormous to ever be repaid. The rain kept falling, and Elias kept staring at the ceiling. And somewhere across the city, Helena Rowe was probably doing the same thing. Both of them trapped in the same storm, but drowning in completely different ways. The courtroom smelled like old wood and broken promises. And Elias sat in the witness box at exactly 10:47 a.m. with his hands folded on the railing. Because if he didn't hold on to something solid, he might float away from the sheer unreality of looking across 20 feet of polished floor at Helena Rowe, sitting behind the bench in her black robe. her face a carefully constructed mask of professional neutrality that couldn't quite hide the terror swimming in her eyes, because they both knew what was about to happen. What had to happen. What the universe had orchestrated with cruel precision when it put a janitor and a judge on the same rainy road 2 weeks ago. Bennett had prepped him for 3 hours last night, drilling him on what to say and what not to say. But all those rehearsed answers felt like ash in Elias's mouth now, because this wasn't a legal proceeding anymore. This was a reckoning between two people who'd saved each other in completely different ways, and he couldn't remember his lines when Helena's hand trembled slightly as she lifted her gavel to call the hearing to order, when her voice cracked almost imperceptibly on his name. "Mr. Ward, please state your full name for the record." Like saying it out loud made the nightmare real. "Elias Michael Ward," he said, and his voice came out steadier than he felt. Steadier than he had any right to be when the woman who'd called him insufficient 3 years ago now owed him her life, and neither of them knew how to exist in that impossible equation. The gallery behind him was packed with reporters who'd gotten wind that something dramatic was brewing, their pens poised over notebooks like vultures waiting for carrion, and Elias could feel their hunger for tragedy, their desperate need for this story to end in spectacle rather than grace. And he wondered if he was about to give them what they wanted or disappoint them entirely, because even he didn't know which version of himself would speak when Bennett asked the first question. "Mr. Ward, can you describe your relationship with your daughter, Sophie?" Bennett began. And that was easy. That was the only truth Elias knew how to tell without hesitation. "She's everything," he said simply, and the words landed in the courtroom like stones in still water, rippling outward. "She's why I work 3 jobs, why I haven't slept more than 4 hours a night in 3 years, why I keep showing up even when the world tells me I'm not enough. She's the reason my heart beats and my lungs breathe and my feet keep moving forward when everything else says stop." Helena's pen scratched against paper, and Elias watched her write something in the margin of her notes, watched her hand shake slightly, watched her blink 3 times in rapid succession like she was fighting back tears that judges weren't supposed to cry in open court. And he felt something shift in his chest, some small crack in the wall of anger he'd built around himself since Bennett's phone call. "And can you tell the court about the night of October 23rd, when you encountered a car accident on Riverside Drive?" Bennett asked. And the entire courtroom leaned forward because this was the moment they'd all been waiting for. The collision of past and present. The impossible coincidence that only happened in movies, except it had happened in real life, with real consequences. Could you save the life of someone who destroyed yours? Drop a comment if you know what you'd do. Subscribe if you believe some debts transcend justice. Elias took a breath and looked directly at Helena, holding her gaze even when she tried to look away, even when her composure started crumbling at the edges. "I was driving home from my shift at Lincoln Elementary when I saw a car go off the road in the storm. The driver was trapped and the car was smoking, and I didn't think about who they were or what they'd done to me. I just saw another human being who needed help." "And did you recognize Judge Rowe at that time?" Bennett pressed. "No," Elias said quietly. "I recognized her later, at the school, when she pretended we'd never met, when she ran from me like I was the ghost of her guilty conscience instead of the man who'd saved her life." The gallery erupted in whispers, and Helena's gavel came down hard. "Order." But her voice wavered, and Elias saw what no one else could see from their angle. A single tear tracking down her cheek that she quickly wiped away with the back of her hand. "Mr. Ward," Bennett said, "why did you save her?" And Elias leaned forward, his voice dropping to something raw and honest and devastating. "Because mercy doesn't ask permission first. Because kindness doesn't check your credentials before deciding you're worth saving. Because sometimes your judge is the one who needs forgiveness the most. The courtroom went silent, and Helena's gavel slipped from her fingers, clattering against the bench. Helena's gavel hit the floor and rolled toward the edge of the bench, and nobody moved to catch it because the entire courtroom had stopped breathing, stopped existing in normal time, stopped functioning as a place of law and order, and became instead a confessional where something sacred and terrible was about to be born from the wreckage of 3 years of injustice. "Your Honor," the bailiff said uncertainly, reaching for the gavel. But Helena raised her hand to stop him. And when she stood up from behind the bench, the black robe she wore suddenly looked less like authority and more like a costume she'd been hiding behind. A shield that no longer protected her from the truth she'd been running from since the night Elias pulled her from that smoking car. "Mr. Ward," Helena said, and her voice wasn't the polished courtroom voice anymore, wasn't the measured tone of judicial propriety, but something broken and human and barely holding together. "May I speak?" Bennett looked at Elias with confusion because judges didn't ask permission to speak in their own courtrooms, didn't step down from the bench mid-hearing, didn't look at defendants with eyes full of tears and something that looked dangerously close to collapse. But Elias nodded once, and Helena descended the 3 steps from her elevated position like a queen abdicating a throne she'd never deserved to occupy. She stood in the center of the courtroom, equidistant between Elias and the gallery, and her hands trembled as she reached up and unfastened the clasps of her robe, letting it fall to the floor in a black pool at her feet. And the reporters gasped because this was unprecedented. This was career suicide. This was a judge publicly dismantling her own authority in a room full of witnesses and cameras that would replay this moment forever. 3 years ago, I made a decision that I told myself was about the law, Helena said, her voice growing stronger, even as tears streamed down her face. I told myself I was protecting a child by denying custody to a father who didn't have enough money, enough stability, enough of what I decided mattered. But I was wrong. Would you sacrifice everything you built to tell the truth? Hit subscribe if integrity matters more than reputation. Comment below if some apologies come too late. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, but Helena pushed through them, her eyes locked on Elias, who sat frozen in the witness box, watching this woman destroy herself in real time. I was wrong because I measured your worth by your bank account instead of your heart. Because I looked at your apartment instead of your character. Because I made you prove you were sufficient, when sufficiency was never the question, love was the question, and you had more of it than any father I've ever seen in 20 years on this bench. Judge Rowe, you need to stop talking, the bailiff warned, moving toward her, but she shook her head fiercely. No, I need to finish what I should have said 3 years ago, when I had the chance to be just instead of judgmental, Helena said. Turning to address the entire courtroom now, her voice rising with the courage of someone who'd finally stopped running from their own conscience. I denied Elias Ward custody of his daughter Sophie because I was operating from bias, from classism, from a fundamental failure to see that poverty doesn't equal inadequacy and wealth doesn't equal worthiness. And in doing so, I separated a child from the one person who loved her unconditionally. Bennett was scribbling frantically on his notepad, probably calculating the legal implications of a judge confessing to judicial misconduct in open court. But Elias couldn't look away from Helena's face, couldn't process the magnitude of what she was sacrificing, couldn't reconcile the terrified woman he'd saved with this warrior standing in the ruins of her career, speaking truth, like it was the only thing that mattered anymore. And then 2 weeks ago, this man I'd wronged so profoundly saved my life, without hesitation, without knowing who I was, without asking if I deserved to be saved, Helena continued. her voice breaking. He showed me what mercy looks like when it's not conditional, what grace looks like when it's not earned, what humanity looks like when it's not transactional. So I'm not going to hide behind my authority anymore. I'm not going to pretend I deserve to judge anyone when I failed the most basic test of justice. She turned back to Elias, her face wet with tears, but her spine straight with purpose. Elias Ward, I am granting you full custody of Sophie Marie Ward, effective immediately. And I am formally apologizing for the harm my prejudice caused you both. You are not insufficient. You never were. I was. The courtroom exploded into chaos, reporters shouting questions, the bailiff calling for order, Bennett jumping to his feet, but Elias only heard the blood rushing in his ears, only felt the 3 years of shame and anger and grief finally breaking open inside his chest. Only saw Helena standing there, stripped of everything she'd built her identity on, offering him back what she'd stolen with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. This hearing is concluded, Helena said to the court reporter, her voice barely audible over the noise. File the custody order immediately. Then she turned and walked toward the chamber's door while cameras flashed and voices screamed her name, walked away from the career that had defined her, walked into an uncertain future where she was no longer Judge Rowe, but simply Helena. Someone who'd finally chosen truth over self-preservation, even when the cost was everything. The bailiff whispered to someone at the back door, and Elias saw him mouth the words, "Someone's waiting outside to see her." But Helena was already gone, already disappearing into whatever came after redemption, already becoming a woman Elias didn't recognize, and maybe never would. Elias stood outside the courthouse 40 minutes later, with custody papers clutched in his hand like a sacred text, like proof that the universe could still correct its own mistakes, and the rain that had been falling for what felt like centuries had finally stopped, leaving behind that clean, wet earth smell that comes after storms when the world remembers how to breathe again. Bennett had already left to file the emergency paperwork, to make official what Helena's confession had set in motion, and the reporters had scattered to write their headlines about the judge who'd committed professional suicide for the sake of truth. But Elias couldn't move from the courthouse steps because his legs had forgotten how to carry the weight of vindication, had spent so long carrying the weight of shame that freedom felt like vertigo. Sophie was at school right now, sitting in Mrs. Patterson's 3rd grade class, learning about fractions or state capitals or something beautifully ordinary, completely unaware that her entire world had just shifted back onto its proper axis, that tonight she'd come home to their apartment and Elias would tell her she never had to leave again, that the courts had finally acknowledged what his heart had known all along, that he was enough, had always been enough, would always be enough. Can one moment of truth erase years of injustice? Subscribe if you believe redemption is always possible. Comment below if some wounds never fully heal. "Daddy!" The voice hit him like lightning, and Elias spun around to see Sophie running up the courthouse steps, her pink backpack bouncing against her shoulders, her braids flying behind her like victory flags. And his heart stopped because she wasn't supposed to be here. Wasn't supposed to leave school in the middle of the day, and panic flooded his system until he saw Mrs. Patterson trailing behind her with an apologetic smile. "The school got a call from your lawyer," Mrs. Patterson explained breathlessly. "He said to bring her here, said you'd want her to—" But Sophie had already crashed into Elias's legs, wrapping her arms around his waist with the fierce possessiveness of a 7-year-old who'd learned too young what it meant to lose someone you loved. "Mrs. Patterson said we won, Daddy. She said, I will stay with you forever now." Elias dropped to his knees and pulled Sophie into his chest, burying his face in her hair that smelled like the strawberry shampoo he'd bought on sale last week. And he couldn't speak because his throat had closed around 3 years of unshed tears. around the terror of almost losing her permanently, around the relief so profound it felt like dying and being reborn simultaneously. "Forever," he managed to whisper. "You get to stay forever." "Mr. Ward?" The voice was hesitant, almost afraid, and Elias looked up to see Helena standing at the edge of the courthouse steps in civilian clothes. A simple gray sweater and jeans that made her look younger somehow, more vulnerable, less like the authority figure who'd haunted his nightmares, and more like the terrified woman he'd pulled from a smoking car on a night that felt like it happened in another lifetime. Sophie pulled back from Elias and looked at Helena with the uncanny perception children have for recognizing important adults. And before Elias could say anything, Sophie had run over to Helena and wrapped her small arms around the woman's legs exactly the way she'd just hugged him, and Helena gasped like she'd been punched. "Thank you for telling the truth," Sophie said, with the simple directness of someone too young to understand the magnitude of what that truth had cost. "Daddy said the brave people are the ones who fix their mistakes, even when it's scary." Helena's face crumpled, and she dropped to Sophie's level, her hands hovering uncertainly before settling gently on the little girl's shoulders. "Your daddy is the bravest person I've ever met," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And you are so, so lucky to have him." "I know," Sophie said matter-of-factly. "He makes the best pancakes, and he never forgets to check for monsters under my bed, and he sings really bad. But I like it anyway." Despite everything, despite the years of anger, despite the injustice, despite the cosmic cruelty of their intertwined fates, Elias felt a laugh bubble up from somewhere deep in his chest. And when Helena looked at him over Sophie's head, with eyes that held equal parts gratitude and devastation, he found himself walking toward them both, found himself standing in the space where forgiveness and fury coexisted in impossible tension. "Why did you do it?" he asked quietly, needing to understand what had pushed her over the edge after 3 years of silence. "Why destroy your career for us?" Helena stood slowly, keeping one hand on Sophie's shoulder like the child was an anchor keeping her from floating away into the wreckage of her former life. "Because I've spent 20 years on that bench believing justice was about following rules and precedent and legal standards," she said. "But you taught me in one night that justice is actually about seeing people really seeing them. And I'd been blind for so long, I forgot what vision looked like." Would you risk everything to correct a wrong you'd committed? Hit subscribe if conscience matters more than career. Share this if you believe some debts must be paid, regardless of cost. "The reporters are going to crucify you," Elias said. And it wasn't sympathy exactly, but something close to it. Some recognition that they were both casualties of a system that measured worth in all the wrong currencies. "Let them," Helena replied with a sad smile. "I crucified myself every night for 3 years knowing what I'd done to you. Knowing I'd separated a father from his daughter because of prejudice I was too arrogant to acknowledge. This is just making the internal punishment external." Sophie tugged on Elias's hand. "Daddy, can we get ice cream now? Mrs. Patterson said we're celebrating." And somehow that simple request from his daughter shattered the remaining tension, because children had a way of dragging adults back to what mattered. Back to the present moment instead of the painful past. Back to the truth that life continued even after the dramatic courtroom confessions and career-ending revelations. "Yeah, baby. We can get ice cream," Elias said. Then looked at Helena, who was already backing away, already preparing to disappear into whatever exile awaited disgraced judges who'd chosen integrity over self-preservation. "You saved me once," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "I just returned the favor." Helena's eyes filled with tears again, but she smiled, really smiled, for the first time since he'd known her. "I think you saved me twice, Mr. Ward. Once from the car and once from myself." She turned to walk away, but Sophie called out, "Wait, what's your name?" Helena paused, glancing back at the little girl whose custody she'd denied and then restored, whose father she'd wronged and who'd forgiven her anyway. "Helena," she said softly. "My name is Helena." "Bye, Helena," Sophie said, waving. "Thank you for being brave." And then Helena was walking away down the courthouse steps into the afternoon sunlight that had finally broken through the clouds, walking into an uncertain future where she was no longer a judge, but simply a woman who'd learned the hardest way possible that mercy given is mercy received. That sometimes the person who destroys your life is the one fate sends for your redemption. That grace doesn't ask permission before transforming everything it touches. Elias watched her go while holding his daughter's hand, and the custody papers in his pocket felt less like a legal victory and more like proof that the universe occasionally remembered to balance its own scales, occasionally allowed the broken to be made whole, occasionally turned storms into sunlight when you'd finally stopped expecting rescue. "Come on, Daddy," Sophie said, pulling him toward the street. "You promised ice cream." And Elias let himself be led by his daughter into the rest of their lives, into the ordinary beautiful future they'd been denied for 3 years, into the knowledge that sometimes justice arrives late, but arrives nonetheless, carrying with it the possibility that even the deepest wounds can heal, if you're willing to believe that all people, even judges who'd failed you, deserve the chance to become better than they were. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to my channel and turn on the notification bell. Stay tuned for my next video. God bless you.